one of the things complexity does is makes me remember that everything can change in an instant. And the things that make the profound changes may be things that are happening out of your peripheral vision, barely noticeable, and then turn out to be the most profound turning points.
Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. In this episode, Neil Theise joins me to discuss microscopes and mystics, what complexity theory is, how it can change your life, and what the meaning of life is. Enjoy. Neil, welcome on the show. I'm so excited talking to you about your chapter in Awakening that was edited by Vern Neufeld-Redekup and Gloria Neufeld-Redekup. And you did tremendous work, and you're talking about complexity theory. And really, as the name already says, it's something very exciting, but also very complex. So please just introduce us to the complexity theory. But first and foremost, I want to ask you, how are you doing? I mean, it's a really distressing time, and I want to say thank you to you to really taking the time.
Oh, no, sure. Thank you. It's funny you're asking to speak about these things at a time when I'm working on a book on this topic. So shameless self-promotion. This will be, it's due in a couple of months. It's a book for lay people. It's not a textbook. And I've finished, I'm on draft 4 now. But the last part of the book is an epilogue, what complexity means to me, and how what I'm finding. Yeah, I've never written a book before. I'm used to writing scientific papers, review articles, opinion pieces, but I've never written, and I'm used to speaking about complexity. But to write a book with some clarity for a general audience is a very new experience. I don't consider myself a writer. And it's been a process of discovering the book that is out there for me to write. I thought it was going to be 18,000 words, a very short little thing. It's now up to 48,000 words. There are more stories than I expected to tell, and different stories than the ones I thought I would be telling. But coming towards the end of the draft, I realized the end of the book has to be, well, what impact have these ideas had on me? And one of the things I was writing about just yesterday is that in difficult times, politically, socially, economically, medically, one of the things complexity does is makes me remember that everything can change in an instant. And the things that make the profound changes may be things that are happening out of your peripheral vision, barely noticeable, and then turn out to be the most profound turning points. And when things are going really well and you're very excited and think that, oh, the world I wanted to see come into being is coming into being, and then you lose it just like that. But at the same time, you think, oh, the world is nothing like I expected. All my hopes seem to be crumbling. All my expectations and intentions seem to be for nothing. And then suddenly there's hope and exhilaration, and things suddenly speed in another direction. I won't say which side of the equation I was on, but I have experienced both the election of President Obama and the election of President Trump. And both of those turned out to be not as good or terrible as I thought, and just as good and terrible as I did not expect. And so I find myself arguing with with friends of mine who are pessimistic and angry and frustrated and fearful that it's not logical or reasonable to hang on that tightly to that despair and anger. Just as overconfidence is not warranted either. And it's complexity that has helped me find a middle ground where I can feel cautiously optimistic enough that I'm not being ground down, but anxious enough to propel me to take action. Because maybe it will be one small gesture from me that is the random element that suddenly changes the course of things. You can't know. So how am I doing? Thanks to complexity, I'm not depressed. I'm not grinding my teeth at night. I'm not having too many migraines or back spasms. And I wake up every morning sort of ready to like go, okay, what's next? The reason complexity is able to help with that is to your more important question, perhaps, or the first part, which is what is complexity? We think of interacting elements to function as to function in systems. So, and there are different kinds of systems. So you have a fully deterministic system that's like a clock or a machine, where every time you turn it on, it will behave in exactly the same way, and the result will always be exactly the same. And for much of our culture for the last 200 years, the imagination of the world has been, the imagination in our culture of how the world works has been one of machine-like determinism. Famously starting with Newton and the idea that mathematical equations could tell you if you throw a rock, this is where it will go. Oh, if you knew everything about the universe, you would know exactly where it would go. And so the world came to be seen as a machine, and all of our metaphors, bodies are machines. We talk at the molecular level of molecular motors that drive things in cells. I was just talking to a surgeon who does transplantation at my medical center. And I'm a liver pathologist, so I work with the liver transplant team. And he said, well, I'm just really a glorified car mechanic. And I was like, no, because bodies are not machines. Therefore, you are not a mechanic. People talk about bioengineering, and biology isn't engineered, it's cultivated. You don't engineer a farm, you don't engineer an ecosystem, you cultivate them. So our language comes from this idea that the world is a machine, and that's faulty. Then there are systems that we refer to as chaotic systems, and they're related to the mathematics of fractals, which fractal geometries, probably everyone you're listening to has heard of fractals and seen pictures of fractals. The shapes of snowflakes, the crystallizing patterns, the way trees branch, that's similar to the way rivers branch, that's similar to the way blood vessels branch in our bodies. The shapes of clouds, the granularity of a coastline. And one of the things about such structures and systems that organize themselves that way is that they're scale invariant. However close you go in, it always looks exactly the same. So when you're flying in a cloud and you see yourself coming towards a cloud, it's hard to know how far you are from the cloud, because as you go in closer and closer, you just see more cloud looking like cloud. There's nothing against which you can assess scale. And so much of the world organizes itself in that way, and weather patterns organize themselves that way, for example. And our ability now, compared to 40 years ago, for how we can make weather predictions. It used to be hours in advance, you'd have some accuracy. Now it's days in advance, sometimes weeks in advance. The reason is that those systems are utterly predictable. If you know the precise starting conditions. So if you have a weather pattern and you repeat it over and over again, it will behave in precisely the same fashion. But small perturbations can change it dramatically. So this is the fabled butterfly in South America flapping its wings, causing a tornado in Texas. But the thing is that that butterfly could flap its wings towards the right or to the left. And one might be a tornado in Texas. The other one might be smooth sailing in the South Pacific. So the father of chaos theory, Konrad Lorenz, talked about it being predictably unpredictable. If you know the starting points, it will always be exactly the same. If there are slight perturbations, it will be different, but it will be different in a way that you can model using using fractal geometry, so you can see what the range of possibilities are. So there's unpredictability that comes into the system, not machine-like, but not exactly free and random either. When that was being studied, in the 1970s, there were some investigators, one of them, most importantly, Chris Langton, who was the guy who came up with the phrase artificial biology, artificial life. And he noticed that if you model living systems, that you can have in a landscape of order and disorder within a computer model, we're speaking sort of a mathematical landscape, that some places would be perfectly ordered, like a machine. Some places would be completely disordered, like molecules in a gas, totally random. And then you'd have other areas that looked like fractal chaos. But when you moved this mathematical probe to see what kind of order existed within this mathematical landscape, as you approach from order towards chaos, there's a zone where suddenly the computer model starts producing behaviors and actual geometric forms that look like living things. And this turned out to be the realm of complexity. It's an information-rich zone. It's the zone where life arises out of all the other elements that exist in the world. It's self-sustaining. It's adaptive. So if the environment around it changes, it finds new ways to change. And it does that by always having a little bit of randomness in the system, so it can try out new possibilities. So an example that's very common for people to use are ant colonies, because everyone knows ants. You grow up, any kid who's grown up anywhere in the world has seen ants, either inappropriately crawling in your house or out in the yard. And ant colonies are very complex, but well-ordered communities. They form food lines, they have storage areas, they have cemeteries where they take the bodies of dead ants from the colony. Some types of ants will actually farm and grow plants or fungus, and they'll have like a farm that's well ordered. And there's no ant in the colony that's organizing this. The queen ant it's not a top-down order. She just serves a reproductive function. This is all bottom-up interactions, the ants signaling each other through contact or through sensing each other's pheromone scents. They have 9 different scents that they can lay down. And out of these local interactions between each other, they form all these elaborate structures. The thing is, it's not 100% certain. It's not 100% machine-like. So there's always a little bit of randomness in the system, which you need, because if the environment changes, if the ants were totally well adapted to that particular environment, the food is over here as opposed to over there, then when the food runs out, they'd have no ability to find new food. So for example, when you have a food line, straight line of ants going from a bit of food over here to the colony over here, going back and forth, there's always a few percent of the ants that aren't following the food line. Those ants are going to be the ones that if you put your foot down in the middle of the food line, those divergent ants are going to be the ones that very rapidly find the new route that's quickest around your foot or your hand in this case. Or if the food source runs out, it's one of those ants not in the line that's already going to hopefully randomly bump into some food and then begin to establish the new food line so that when this runs out, this one takes over. If there's too much randomness in the system, no ant winds up following a line. So too much randomness is no good. But if there's too little randomness, there can't be a change in behavior if the environment shifts. And then things collapse because there's no adaptation. So there needs to be this little tiny zone of limited randomness that's completely unpredictable. And that randomness in that mathematical zone between order and chaos is what allows life to happen, what allows adaptation and evolution and creativity to happen. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about ants or cells in a body or biomolecules in cells or humans in a community or creatures of all kinds in an ecosystem. They all follow all these same principles. And so coming back to my equanimity, thanks to complexity in the face of all our social, economic, medical, and political trauma out here, there's randomness in the system. There's always randomness. Things are going to arise that we can't expect. And those things may be the source of the creativity that allows the system to survive whatever collapses are happening now and grow and flourish in a new way that we couldn't have possibly imagined. And so complex systems are predictably unpredictable. You just don't know. And that not knowing, comes around to my Buddhist practice. That not knowing is the equivalent of what a Buddhist would say is living in the present moment. Not anticipating what the future is, nor hanging on to the past. That's what potentiates you being the perhaps creative pivot for something new to come. So that's how complexity, that's as simple as I can make complexity sound, and also how I'm doing in the present moment because of it.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. And of course, I mean, it's a huge concept, and you really you go down to the molecules, and, as a scientist, and you're also one basically who discovered allegedly, the 80th organ, human organ, so it's a big concept. And obviously you are a very privileged person to actually have access to it because you have this given gift of a scientist and the work you do. And what I find really fascinating is that you just mentioned it, that you also do, Buddhist practice, right? You do meditation, Zen Buddhism.
Yes.
You are a practitioner of it. And you really, in the book, in the chapter, you really write that what we need, or you suggest also, in order to understand complexity theory and really the life we grapple with, as you just said, with COVID, with economic issues, social issues, we really also, what also will help is a re-examination of some of our traditions in some way to bridge the gap between science on the one hand and spirituality on the other hand, which, reading your chapter, I think one of the big issues that we have is that we are so caught up in our daily lives that we always, some part, gets missing. And one part might be, this really aspect, of spiritual life. And of course, some are very gifted, and like you, I mean, you are so busy, but you have this incredible gift to bring your job basically together somehow. I don't know how you do it, because you're leading a huge research team. You are a professor. You're it's just like you do so many things, but you have this gift to bring this all together, and then also talking, to a wider audience, what really this all entails. So just please, what do you mean by re-examination of what you said in the chapter?
I think this is one part of how being a Zen student for a long time has actually played into both my science and my spiritual life, and just how I am in the world with other people, day-to-day relationships. One of the things one learns with Zen is to just be present for what is, without labeling, naming what's in front of you. I mean, this isn't specifically Zen, it's Buddhism in general, it's contemplative practices from all sorts of different cultures. One of the things that most of them share, if not all of them, is this idea of, can you simply be present with what is there in front of you? And this practice on the cushion, sometimes daily, sometimes not, sometimes hourly, sometimes mostly not, of coming back to, in Zen practice, to your breath, to the sensations coming in through your skin and your eyes and your ears and your nose in this particular moment. And then your mind goes where it goes because that's what it does. And then remembering to come back and to come back again. That's what fuels my scientific practice. I'm a pathologist, so my clinical practice is people get a biopsy of something, and liver is my particular specialty. So someone gets a liver biopsy. Do they have hepatitis? Do they have a drug toxicity? Do they have an infection? Is it early or is it late? Will they need a transplant? What kind of medicine might help? Is it too late, or will medicine not be the use? These are the sorts of things I'm assessing. I get the biopsy on my microscope and I look at it. In liver pathology as a subspecialty in particular, we practice not looking at the clinical history. We look at the tissue first, because the liver has so few ways of responding to injury that it's very easy, if you have a preconceived notion of what's causing the injury in the liver, that you can interpret the biopsy biased by that. So we choose not to do that. We look at the biopsy, come up with the range of possible causes, what we call the differential diagnosis. And then once we've worked that through, then we bring in the clinical information to put our differential diagnosis in top order of 1, 2, 3, 4, which helps the clinicians then understand, do we have a diagnosis? Are there other questions and tests we need to do? Is it time for therapeutic interventions, et cetera? So my Zen practice and my pathology practice in this way are kind of the same thing. And I find that pathologists in general who have no spiritual practice, let alone contemplative practice, they don't know that they in fact do have a contemplative practice. It's how you bring your eyes into the microscope, focus down. And what they all have in common, if you ask them, is they don't have an experience of looking through the microscope at the tissue. They just have an experience of the tissue, unmediated. Most of them won't speak about that because they don't pay attention to it. I'm trained to pay attention to it. But when I ask them, yeah, they no longer think about the microscope. And we're playing with the microscope, fiddling with the focus. We're moving the slide around. We're flipping lenses to go closer in or farther away. And we're doing all this. But in our minds, it's just us and the tissue. There's this intimacy. So Zen practice ups the ante on that. Contemplative practice ups the ante. And so I'm aware that I'm doing this when I'm doing it. And what it also allows me to do is see even normal tissues in a fresh way. I don't start off with the assumption that because it's normal, I already know what there is in front of me. So on occasion, rare occasion, but on occasion, I'm surprised. And those little surprises, I don't dismiss. I look at them because that's what Zen practice has taught me to do. What's here in front of me right now? And the result is I've made discoveries. A lot of them basic anatomy that people had not noticed before. You'd think we would know what normal tissues look like now, but we don't. There's a lot we don't know. And this practice has enabled me to see this. In the same way, the reason I can speak about complexity theory is a similar anatomic observation 20 years ago led me to understand, back then now it's a commonplace. People in your generation hear stem cells, and you know that every tissue in the body has stem cells, and stem cells are everywhere you look, and you can do all sorts of crazy things with them. 20 years ago, the skin, the bone marrow, and the GI tract had stem cells. Nothing else did, as far as we knew. People argued in the liver, but the general feeling was the liver didn't have stem cells. I saw a little bit of anatomy that no one had noticed, and it turned out that's where the stem cells hung out. And so I was one of the people who helped define that livers, and in my case, human livers, not just animals, had stem cells. And that was part of the stem cell revolution 20 years ago. Why am I bringing that up? There was a reason. Oh, complexity. So I was doing the stem cell research, and then a friend of mine in England, Peter Ride, is an academic at the University of Westminster, and he had an interest in how interdisciplinary studies happen, how a scientist and an artist might speak to each other, and their practices come together in some creative way that you could not predict. And a friend of his named Jane Prophet, who was an artist, working with virtual reality things. He was also good friends with her, and he's my good friend, and he thought we'd get along together. And we were never, whenever I was in London, she was out of town. And if ever she came to New York, I was out of town. And so to get us together, he got a grant from the Wellcome Trust under the guise of having a scientist and an artist talk to each other. Though it was really driven by, he just wanted me and Jane to meet. And so we got a grant where she came to New York and I went to London, and he recorded all our conversations. So they were transcribed. We didn't have to come up with a project or a proposal or a report. They just wanted to create a body of experience documented that people could study how an artist and a scientist might learn to communicate with each other. And I was talking about stem cells, and she said to me, "Oh, that kind of reminds me about how ants move around and interact." And I said, "What are you talking about?" Because I don't think of cells as interacting with each other like ants. And she said, "Oh, complexity theory. It's how systems become alive and you can have artificial life." And she told me about a program called Technosphere that she had created with a modeling partner, a computer partner, to create a world in which people could put their little virtual creatures in. And she was interested in how people respond emotionally to virtual creatures they've created. But when the number of creatures in the world of Technosphere got into the thousands, they started displaying behaviors that had not been programmed into the system. It turned out they had created a virtual complex system. And the artificial life world, including Chris Langton, got wind of what they were doing. And they said, "This is artificial life." And they said, "No, it's just a computer system." And they said, "No, Technosphere is alive now," because it was doing things on its own. So this is how I came to complexity theory. So because I had this friend who I made when I went to London to learn liver pathology, and on the weekends, I wandered into an art gallery where he was working as a curator, and we hit it off and became friends. And he had this friend who was an artist. And he thought, oh, let's put them in the room. These three divergent ants suddenly created this whole new thing. What Zen brought me to in this context was when she said, oh, ants are like cells. I didn't dismiss this, even though it sounded a little crazy at the moment. But I was like, let's be present for what she's telling me. Let me listen. And this turns out to be one of the hallmarks of not only how we became successful as a collaboration, and everything I've done in complexity terms since then, everything we're talking about, I can only speak about because I happened to meet Jane. And on this particular afternoon, it was, I think, May 2nd, 2001, in my office, which is documented in the transcripts, she told me about this. And that was one of those little moments, unlooked for, sent my life off in a completely different direction. But I was ready for it, in part because my spiritual practice had taught me to pay attention and to not push away something unexpected. I can't remember what your question was.
No, but
this is how I go.
No, but I love it. And you know what I loved also in this chapter is how you said that the religion or traditions, or in this sense, really spirituality, helps us to open new possibilities or frame new questions for science, and then the science gives ultimately to these questions, the precision, that we have learned or we can look up in the books and religious texts that people back then already had intuitively, inside them. This was so fascinating how you bring this together with complexity theory. This is what I find is so helpful, to think about it in a way that reconciles, tradition, in this sense, or spirituality in a broad sense, and the science, what you're doing.
Do you have your own experience of that kind of moment where the two things connect and suddenly you're like, oh, the bottom drops out and you have a depth of understanding or experience that you didn't have before? Have you ever had that kind of moment?
This is a really good question. What I usually experience, or what happened, the older I grew, is the most beautiful moments are really the most simple moments, when you just get up and you make a coffee or whatever, and you sit, you look outside, the morning, just the flowers and the sky, and there's nothing, in my case, that is as profound as this, to me. Mm-hmm. And I don't know from where it comes from, but this is something that I discovered, 5 years maybe ago or so, that these are the most amazing experience that I feel so truly alive. I think we can call it joy, something that you just feel so connected to everything what is around you. I don't know, I don't have the language to describe it, but this is something that really profoundly, shapes my life, that it's not the big things, but it's really in the little things we find this magic. And if you have this insight like you have, you look into human bodies and you look at the liver and all those kind of things. To me, I wonder, because I don't have this privilege, for example, I wonder how it is like if you have this insight that you have, and that when you wake up, what it is for you, how you feel, see, and really ultimately experience, life. So I'm just very curious, when you get up, tell a little bit about your routine. Maybe you love coffee or tea. I really want to know. This is something.
Well, so there are those of us in the world like you who have the privilege of being able to get out of their own way and wake up in the morning and experience the world with that simplicity and that directness in a way that gives you a feeling of joy, is the word you use, of bliss, of quiet, of peace, of intimacy, all good, positive things. Not everyone feels that way. Most of my colleagues I work with, physicians, I would not say they're experiencing the world that way. We're very high-powered professionals. We came up through a very, very, very competitive educational process. We're selected for competition, for hyper stimulation. We run on caffeine. It took me a long time to get to caffeine because my parents were British, so I grew up drinking tea. And it wasn't until my 30s that I realized, wait, I'm working at a disadvantage. When I was at a conference, an international conference, and I was giving the first talk after lunch in Switzerland at 1 o'clock. Everyone had some kind of jet lag or other. I'm about to go on stage and I'm having a cup of tea and everyone else is drinking their espresso and I'm ready to fall asleep. And I realized they're all self-medicating. And I went and I got my first bottle of caffeine pills. So when I get up in the morning, since then, that was 30 years ago, I take a caffeine pill in the morning because I don't like coffee and tea does not do the trick. So you have that privilege. For my people, I think the utility of talking about complexity is a way of, it's, you know, when I speak about it with all kinds of audiences, I've done this for, you know, graduate student cell biologists. I've done it for Zen students. I've done it for fifth graders. My nephew, when he was in fifth grade, wanted me to come to his class and tell the fifth graders about this. It doesn't matter, yoga studios, physicians and nurses, you name it. Speaking with Vern's crowd at St. Paul University at a conference on social, economic, political stuff. Whenever I speak about this, whenever I speak about it, people are excited by it, intrigued by it. I start with the ants because, like I said, it's true. Everybody knows ants. And because they knew them as kids, it immediately starts to bring in a little bit of innocence to their awareness, because you talk about ant colonies and everyone remembers that moment as a kid, you're looking at the ants. And then I start to unwrap it. And even the fifth graders, and I don't change the language, I don't simplify or, you know, everybody basically gets the same stuff from me. The fifth graders, the teachers had to call the parents to tell them they were holding the school buses. I was the last period of the day. And the kids were so excited asking questions that they didn't want to interrupt it. And they held the school buses so the kids could keep going with me for like an hour after school was over. But this is kind of the experience I have all the time. If you have the privilege of being a person who can come to that kind of moment anxiety-free, unanticipating already what lies ahead of you in the day, that you can pause in your first moments of the day and that kind of quiet, that's a privilege. Most people I know in New York City do not wake up like that. Some of them will wake up and sit down on the meditation cushion, me too sometimes, to try and make myself begin my day that way. But if I oversleep or I'm just so pressured or whatever, I don't get that. My day starts and I'm off running. I'm checking my emails, I'm getting into the shower, I'm getting dressed, I'm heading out the door. That's my day. When I give people the simple tools of how to look at a complex system and recognize it that way, they start to see it when they walk outside, because everywhere you look, there's complexity. You see a tree. How is that tree turning the sunlight and the water and the atoms and molecules in the soil through its system into leaves? How does that happen? A flock of birds has a shape. How does it have that shape? How does it move from here to there? You're walking down the sidewalk and you don't have I'm a New Yorker. I'm walking down the street completely thinking about what my responsibilities, what's coming at me for the rest of my day. Why aren't I bumping into people on the sidewalk? Because we're all making subtle movements so that we all swim past each other. There are no traffic jams on a New York sidewalk, except in areas with tourists who don't understand how to walk in New York City, right? And then you can even see, oh, when it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? Because the rules aren't being obeyed. Those feedback loops that we've all trained with each other to have that allows us to pass each other freely on the sidewalk. People who haven't trained here don't have those interactions and they muck up our works. So complexity allows you to stop, if your eye lands on something and you just have a single moment of going, oh, that's a complex system. Because I've conveyed that concept, they might have a moment where they stop and aren't caught up in their day, but stop and notice the wonder of, why does that flock of birds move that way? Oh, I know a little bit about why that happens. And so I find people come back to me after I've given talks about this stuff. They'll come back to me and say, oh, I'm starting to notice things. So for some people with certain kinds of minds, complexity is what in Buddhism we would call skillful means. It's a skillful means to redirect their attention to something more present, in the moment, and fundamental. And how that unwraps from there is kind of where the interesting stuff happens. For me, I've had the religious impulse since I was a kid. I grew up Jewish in a middle-class suburban family in Connecticut. My parents were from Europe. My dad's from Germany, a family of Holocaust survivors. So there was a lot of intensity around Jewish practice and Jewish survival when I was growing up. My community really valued the children because these were the survivors and the children were the hope. So we were like a treasure in the community. I think that conditioned me to appreciate my religion in some ways, and it wasn't oppression or dictate. It was something nurturing. And then in college, I encountered Zen Buddhism, and growing up, gay, middle class, educated in a secular public school system, I didn't have access to the kinds of Jewish mystical stuff that might have sparked me. I was looking for something like that. I had all the academic stuff. The devotional practice of Judaism was very rich for me, but there was not a contemplative practice, which I'm looking back now, obviously I was looking for. I found that in Zen, and I found those to be complementary. But my fundamental instinct when I was younger, I think this may be the introduction to the new book I'm writing, I'm not sure. It's been on my mind, was that as a kid, like 3, 4, 5 years old, I experienced the world in a very intimate fashion. I felt connected to it. And that was the source of a big part of my spiritual impulse on the one hand and my scientific impulse on the other. The gift I had was that my mind works in terms of scientific thinking. I was asking questions very early. How does this happen? Why does it happen like that? So those are scientific questions as a kid first asked them. So that's the way my brain was structured. But the impulse came out of recognizing that I had this intimacy with the world and that sense of connection to the world. And that's the spiritual impulse as well. And my scientific practice was an expression of that and a search to understand that. And my spiritual practice the same. I did not expect these two things to come together in any way. In high school, when Orthodox relatives of mine would try and get me to see fundamentalists, would try and get me to see how I wouldn't have to believe in evolution. You know, if I believe in the Bible, then I shouldn't believe in evolution and that kind of stuff. And I explicitly said to them, I don't even need to have this conversation. They are two separate things for me, and I don't care whether they're talking to each other or not, which was a limited aspiration, but it's how I felt. And in adulthood, I pursued both those paths sort of independently. And there was some crosstalk, as they would be, because they're in me, but it was nothing, they were not pressing questions. But when Jane taught me about complexity and ants as a way of looking at stem cells, and I was involved in this pioneering work in a community of pioneers looking at how cells in the body organize themselves, it became a kind of obsessional thinking, that thinking about the cells in the body moving around, going from one place to another. Why are they doing that? What do they experience as they're moving? What is it like when they move from here to there? Bringing my mind down in my imagination to that. It became like we have in Zen practice, koans, like what's the sound of one hand clapping being a very famous koan. These stories or descriptions of moments of awakening that a student will meditate on that have no logical answer. A more classical one would be a monk asked Master Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? The straightforward answer to that is, of course, because everything has Buddha nature. Buddha nature being sort of the seamlessness of existence. And Master Chaochu responds, mu, which in Japanese means no or nothing. And hearing the masters say mu, the monk has an awakening experience. So that's the koan. What the hell are you supposed to do that? You're supposed to experience mu, become mu, and in the process have some fundamental awareness that you bring to your teacher and interview, and they go, yes, you've got it, or no, you don't. Back out you go. My cells moving in my body like ants became like that kind of question. I wasn't studying cells on a slide or cells in an experimental animal. I was studying the things of which I'm comprised, and walking around town day in and day out, more and more obsessively thinking about this. It became hard sometimes to walk. There was a moment where I came to the edge of Park Avenue and 20th Street, and the light changed for me to walk across the street, and I couldn't move my leg because I was experiencing my leg as a community of cells. And how do you herd a community of cells to take a first step off the curb? And I had to remember, wait, I'm a body. I can tell this what to do. So one morning I was sitting in the Zendo. I was responsible for opening the morning in the Zendos back then on Thursdays. And back then there weren't too many people coming in the mornings. So that morning I happened to be there by myself, and I was meditating. And I was at one end of the Zendo, and the altar with the incense stick was on the other end. And I was meditating, and I was supposed to be working on a koan, but I was working on my koan of the stem cells. I couldn't turn it off. And I was experiencing my body as this community of cells moving around in my imagination. But more than that, something deeper. And at some point I looked up and I saw the smoke coming off the incense stick. And it was just this moment of, am I the stick or the smoke? Am I the body or the cells? I'm both. I'm neither. It's both and, it's not either or. And And I realized when Buddhists talk about inherent things having no inherent existence, the emptiness of inherent existence, when Buddhists talk about emptiness, they mean things have no inherent existence. If you change your perspective, they disappear. I realized this is a form of emptiness. Something looks like a thing, a body, ceases to be a thing when you look at the lower level of scale. At the microscopic scale, it's just a community of cells. And those cells, at the nanoscopic level, there's no cell, there's just molecules floating in water, interacting with each other. And higher up, walking down the street, I cease to be a body that's this solid thing. I become part of a process of people moving down the sidewalk. Whether one is a thing or a phenomenon depends on your point of view. This is emptiness of inherent existence. And I took this to my teacher in interview, and I said, I'm working on the wrong koan, but is this what emptiness means? And she said, yeah. And I said, that's it? And she said, well, it's simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. It took me years to come to just that moment. And now I can tell you this, and it's a concept. But when I looked at the incense stick, it was an experience. And that's the spiritual transformation moment. So when I present this stuff to people in the context of, let's say, a Zen meditation retreat where people are meditating hours a day, and I can present this as some kind of a Dharma talk, people have awakening experiences in response to it. I wish I could do that for myself more often. But so the answer suddenly was there is no separation between the science and the spiritual. In that moment, I mean, the whole story I just told you, I wasn't a scientist or a spiritual practitioner looking for a way to bring them together. It was the same thing. When we talk about science as a way, one way to frame this is science is the best way with rigor and precision was the word you used earlier, to look at the true nature of reality and describe it. Spiritual practice is trying to look for the true nature of reality and describe it. Just because we've got two methods, why would we expect there to be two different true natures of reality? If it's the true nature of reality, there's only one true nature of reality, but we're perceiving it through different means. One Zen monk got angry with me after my talk and said, the Buddha doesn't need you to explain Buddhism. I said, that's true. But some of us can't hear the Buddhist message so easily, but we can hear this other message. It's just skillful means. So if it's useful, then it's useful. If it's not useful, that's fine. Mine isn't the only way to teach this stuff, obviously. For some people, the way to teach this stuff is work in a soup kitchen, demonstrate compassion, be a nurse in a clinic, experience it that way. For some people, it is academic study. Rabbinical students studying the Talmud, becoming so intimate with the text and with each other's minds over that text, have these moments too. Or some people just spontaneously, they wake up in the morning and they get their coffee and they look out the window and they just like, there it is.
Yeah, Neil, Dr. Neil, it's so fascinating. And, how you bring, the science and the spirituality together, and we could just go on and on, but really the last question, yeah, I mean, it's just outstanding. Like the last question to you, what is to you the meaning of life with all what you just said?
Something I was working on for my epilogue for my book yesterday too. Because I start the new book with the idea that understanding complexity can potentially help you find meaning if you're missing that feeling. I think meaning comes from connection. and a feeling, a connection to others, connection to the world. And I think the absence of meaning comes from experiencing yourself as this bounded creature inside your skin that's alone and can't reach out to touch or be open to being touched by what's out there. I think the lack of meaning many people experience, I have sometimes experienced, comes from being so caught up in the shoulds and should nots of current culture and the responsibilities we take on, maybe in building a career or building, being involved in a family that you didn't ask to be part of, or are part of a social network that you're part of because you have to do it, not because it's an instinct to do it. I think those kind of situations are where we lose meaning, lose a sense of meaning. And I think where we feel meaning is when we feel connected, either through a web of emotion, affection, responsibility that's taken on willingly and appropriately. That you feel yourself to not be bounded by your skin, but intimately relating to things around you. That's where meaning comes from. And one of the ways complexity can help open that up is, I'll try to make this quick. At this level, you're an object and I'm an object bounded by our skins, and you are listening to me and I'm listening to you. But if we were in the same room together and we shook hands or hugged, our bodies are comprised also of bacteria, without which we can't exist as human bodies. And my bacteria will exchange with your bacteria. And if you live with anybody, other humans or pets, the living community of bacteria without which you can't be alive actually transcend the limits of your body. At the cellular level, the limits of your body are actually the space of your living quarters, including the skin cells that you shed that make the dust in the room. Where's the limits of your body at the cellular level? They're out there. At the atomic level, there's no atom in your body that you didn't breathe, drink, or eat from the entire planet. At the atomic level, what's the limits of your body? It's the entire planet. It's true that we are separate beings that live on the surface of this rock we call Earth. It is equally true, and undeniably so, that we are the Earth that has figured out over 4.5 billion years to self-organize its atoms into creatures that think of themselves as separate. But we're nothing but the Earth. At the quantum level, where's the boundary? It's the entire universe. The universe isn't an empty box, a location in which we live. We are the substance of the universe that has self-organized in a complex system sort of way into creatures that can talk to each other and have these perceptions and feelings. So complexity shows us that we're not bounded. In an undeniably contemporary scientific way, the idea that we're separate from each other is illusion and delusion. To me, that turns into an imperative of, I know I can overcome the illusion now that I've got an intellectual construct to escape the delusion of separateness. That to me tells me I really need to meditate. It's the most important thing I can do because I want the experience, not just the concept, but the experience of that connection. But like I said, people can feel that intimacy of connection through other means. Finding how to not feel separate, to learn to understand that it isn't a greeting card, it isn't an empty spiritual aphorism that we are all one, but the fact is we are all one. We are all expressions of a single seamless universe. The meaning of our lives is that we are expressions together of the universe in every single moment. How much more meaning do you need than that? You are the universe expressing yourself.
I think, Dr. Neil, there is no more powerful message than this. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your outstanding work, saving lives. And thank you so much for being on the show. And lastly, really, I can't wait to purchase your book that hopefully is very soon out there. Do
I
you already
can't
have
wait.
do you already have like a deadline or a date that might come out?
I can't wait for it to be finished because I'm done. It's supposed to get handed in a couple of months, and then apparently it takes a year to actually come out into the world. So in 2023, earlier than later, I hope, it will be finished. I don't even have a title. Current working title, Notes on Complexity, but I have no idea what it's even going to be called. So, but you've already heard me talk about it, so you don't need to buy the book. I didn't say that.
Thank you so much, Neil,
Sure.
for your time
you,
and
Yannick.
for all you do.
Thank you for all you do too, and for your time. Be well.
Dr. Neil Theise.